question we're asking everybody is, why are you running and why are you the best candidate?
My name is Chris Bell, and I'm running for the U.S. Senate because I think it's very important that we take down Donald Trump and his chief water boy, John Cornyn. I think he's become an enabler and an apologist for the president, and I think the president is morally bankrupt and taking us in a very wrong direction. And looking at this race and looking at what had happened in 2018, I really felt like there was a great opportunity for the Democratic Party, but I felt like it would take somebody with my experience in order to make a run and go toe-to-toe with John Cornyn. I'm the only one in the race who's actually served in Congress. I'm the only one who's won a statewide primary, and I'm finding that experience to be really invaluable as I travel around the state. One thing I didn't know going in is whether there'd be a whole lot of people involved that were involved back in 2006, but the pleasant surprise has been there are a lot, and it's really nice to have somewhat of a foot in the door when we go to areas outside your own city. And I just think, given where we stand right now here in the state of Texas, we really need a senator willing to lead, and on issues like climate change and guns and health care. Those are all issues that are extraordinarily serious for the people of Texas. Healthcare, obviously, because we have the highest number of uninsured. Climate change, because we're the energy capital of the world and we're perfectly positioned to lead the way toward alternative resources, working with the oil and gas industry. And on guns, since we have such a high gun ownership, it seems like opinions are shifting. I think we could really send a very strong statement with a senator who is for red flag laws and for universal background checks, and also champions a ban and buyback program. And of course, immigration is another issue that comes up routinely, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk about. But all of these issues, I really do think we're needing strong leadership from Texas that we're not getting from John Cornyn. And that's why I decided to make the race.
So my name is Cristina Tzintzun Ramirez. You know, for me, when I thought about running, I think about the moment that we're in, that I think people are desperate to have a government that works for and belongs to the American people. And when I think about every single major issue that our country faces, I see that most of those issues come home here to Texas, whether that's climate change, immigration, healthcare, or income inequality, that perhaps no state has more to lose or gain than Texas on those issues. And that we need someone that is willing to be a leader for our state, that is willing to be the fighter and champion on those issues, especially as the state that's the second largest economy, the second most populous state in the country. And that we face three multiple crises at the same time as a country, that we face a crisis in our democracy, a crisis in our economy, and a crisis around climate. But I think out of crisis comes opportunity. I have spent my entire career bringing people into the halls of government and making government work for ordinary people, bringing people into the political process that may not have believed before in our democracy or political process, and making passing legislation that's changed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in our state. And I want to bring that same energy into this process, and also the same imagination that I've brought to tackle big issues that a lot of times politicians didn't realize or weren't perhaps in the most creative position to tackle when I was, for example, at Workers' Defense Project. But beyond those issues, the truth is that as great as all of us are as candidates, that no one wins in Texas unless they drive up voter turnout, especially amongst young people and Latinos. We need a multiracial coalition to defeat John Cornyn. But no one in this field knows better than me how to drive up turnout amongst young voters and Latino voters, which are the exact voters we need to get out. And so I'm proud of my record as having crafted Beto's campaign plan to get out Latino voters across the state and had a 250% increase in the Latino vote. And also from having founded JOLT that ushered in a new generation of young people. I believe that we win by running the most robust get out the vote campaign here in Texas, and making people believe that government can work for them, and that the way it works for them is by voting and engaging in a political process in a democracy where they may not have felt their voices heard before. And I know that I know how to do that and bring people together to see their common interests and their collective power.
Yes. Hi, I'm Amanda Edwards, and I'm running for the U.S. Senate because I believe that people in this state and in this nation deserve real results in their lives. I think we have gotten too accustomed to seeing and hearing people make campaign promises, but under-delivering on those promises. And I think that people deserve not only to hear the messaging, but also be able to realize and see the transformation that comes from it. I grew up in Houston, and I've had the pleasure for the last 4 years to serve 2.3 million Texans as an at-large Houston City Council member. And in that journey, not only have I been effective, but I've also made sure that the people have seen the benefits of the work that I've done and the work that we were able to accomplish together. I remember after Harvey struck and 51 inches of rainfall fell across our community, and the surprise on the faces of many of our constituents, many of our lower income senior citizen constituents, when I would step foot on their doorsteps to help them get those walls removed from their homes that had been soiled by the floodwater. And that surprise, or the question of whether I was standing there because it was election time, is a part of this dysfunction that we must fix today. We have got to get to a space and place where we know how to find people's homes when it's time to actually deliver for them, rather than simply finding them along a campaign trail. We have to make it bigger. We have to make democracy work for people. And I think that's part of the opportunity that we face here today. When we saw in the 2018 election cycle, Beto did remarkably well with regard to getting what we call persuadable voters out to vote. People who were independent, people who were in the suburbs, did extremely well there. But there were still votes and still some opportunity left on the table. Namely, when you looked at communities of color, there were high registration levels, but those registered voters did not come out to vote above 50%. They were under 50% of the registered numbers. Same thing happened with respect to people under the age of 35. High registration levels, but they came back out less than 50%. So if you could have a candidate who not only can, by virtue of her politics, get those persuadable voters, the people in the middle, build that coalition, but then build upon that, make it additive, bring coalitions, communities of color into the fold and get them motivated to vote, get 35-year-olds and younger also motivated and energized to vote. One of the key ways to do that is in terms of restoring that confidence. A lot of the time when you see there's high registration but lower turnout, there's a disconnect in terms of whether democracy works for them. And you have to have a candidate that can say to the question, why should I believe you? I've heard this promise before. Why should I believe you that it will be different this time? And the answer must be from a messenger who can say, you should believe me because it has been different for the communities I've represented. And that's what's going to help bridge those coalitions together and, of course, achieve the results.
It's my alarm when I wake up, that exact sound, so I have an immediately jarring reaction to it.
Did you want to finish your thought?
No, it's fine. No, it's fine. I don't want to go over.
No, you can go over it if you need to. So what is the most important piece of legislation that Congress can pass next year? If you could identify one, and what would your position be on it?
When I was about 10 years old, my dad was diagnosed with cancer. And he passed away when I was 17. But it was through that experience where I learned about what our healthcare system was. And I'd ask my dad what happens if the insurance company was going to say no. What happened then? And he'd say we'd try to figure something else out. When I'd ask him, well, what happens when people can't figure something else out? And the truth is, for millions of us, that's a life and death question. And because of the urgency of the issue, because of how pervasive it is, not just in the state of Texas, but across all of America in terms of being able to be impacted by access to health care, I believe that is my number one issue to address. And what I would like to see us do is make sure that we keep in mind how urgent these issues are, meaning the life and death nature of them, and get results immediately. I believe that we have to improve upon and expand the Affordable Care Act. The way to go about doing that is by including a public option. That was originally the intent, was to have a public option incorporated. But in addition to a public option, you would, and of course with the public option, those that employer-based insurance does not work for them, they can then choose to go for the public option. I have signed up for the very first time for the Affordable Care Act, and I will tell you, as someone who's been a long-standing attorney, when I looked at the exchange, I said, geez, well, what happens if somebody's not able to make a more sustainable type of wage? And we've got to do better than what we've presented, and I think we can. I think the political appetite is there now. I think we also need to look at how we can go about making sure that people are not underinsured. So there have been there's been an expansion of the short-term insurance loophole, which then basically underinsures people and they don't even realize it when that's in fact happening at the time. I think we also have to make sure that we drive the premium costs down, making sure that we now have a more predictable pool of insureds, but also have more transparency in billing. That's been a huge problem with regard to insurance and also costs overall of our healthcare system, is the lack of transparency in billing. We need to definitely play a closer look at that. I think also, while we're examining how we improve upon the Affordable Care Act, I think we need to go ahead and address the prescription drug crisis that we face. I interviewed several months ago an elderly woman out of Lubbock who was rationing her prescription drugs on a daily basis. In the morning, she takes her prescription drug portion, and at night, instead of taking the second half of her prescription drug portion, she takes the over-the-counter equivalent, I suppose. But of course, that's not in line with what her prescription actually calls for. And there are millions of people also in our country who are doing the very same thing each and every single day in silence. We have to speak for those people by making sure we're putting mechanisms in place that they can access care, that they can access their drugs, and then most importantly, that once they do have access to a system, it's adequate enough to fit their needs. Because the last thing on earth you ever want to hear is if you are actually in need of health care coverage and they tell you, well, this item is not covered.
So when I think about the major issues that we face, I think that we can have multiple priorities, but the truth is that our democracy is incredibly broken, that we see hyper-partisanship. If we look at what just happened with the impeachment hearings last week, where only one Republican representative was willing to vote for convicting the president of high crimes and misdemeanors, that it's okay.
That's my vote.
He just did that to shock you.
Yeah, it's okay. Like, I have to wake up and be somewhere. But for me, every single issue that I care about, we must fix the rules of democracy, that we have elected officials that are not acting in the best interests of the American people, but to their large corporate donors. So I want to support introducing H.R. 1 into the Senate and support its passage to redefine the rules of democracy. But beyond overturning Citizens United, I want us to come to a place as a country where we have publicly financed elections. I think it would change everything in this country on every single issue that we care about. I want us to have an out voter registration system instead of an opt-in voter registration system, something that other states already do, and I think that we could look towards moving forward at a federal level to make sure that more Americans are participating in the electoral process. And I want us to make Election Day a national federal holiday. I believe that democracy works best when people actually have to win on the merit of their ideas. We currently have elected officials, especially in this state, that have been happy not to win with a mandate, but with a minority of voter participation. Democracy has always been a radical idea in this country. From when our nation was founded and we only extended the vote to white landowning men, it was still a radical idea that there would be no kings and that people would have to decide what ideas were in the best interest of the American people and argue for them and win their votes. And I think today democracy is equally as a radical idea, and that we have to expand the franchise, we have to expand the protections of our democracy to make sure that it's working in the best interest of the American people. So that is my number one priority.
It's an extremely difficult question. We could easily say healthcare, could easily say immigration. Obviously, we face a number of challenges, but I think the number one priority, especially for the state of Texas, should be climate change legislation. And I say that because of what I said earlier about Texas being perfectly positioned to lead the way. And if we don't lead the way, we could easily be left behind. Because of our abundance of renewable resources, we're in a very good position to continue to be the energy capital of the world as we transition toward alternative resources. But while there's some very good propositions in the Green New Deal, such as its focus on infrastructure and transitioning some of the jobs, I don't think some of the timetables laid out in the Green New Deal are very realistic, and I don't think it's very realistic to think that the fossil fuel industry is going away tomorrow. And I think we need to be cognizant of what that would do to our economy if it did. Close to 500,000 individuals depend on the oil and gas industry for their jobs here in Texas, and if it did go away tomorrow, it would decimate our economy. And so, based on what I hear in speaking to progressive backers of mine who are in the oil and gas business, there's been a real generational shift in a lot of the major oil and gas companies. And because of that, you're going to find very few climate deniers in the oil and gas business. And they're more than willing to work with the government toward cleaning up our environment. And I think that would be a much easier road to travel, working with the industry to reduce emissions while we put other measures in place to clean our air. The fact of the matter is that during the Obama administration, we were going the right direction and we were reducing emissions. And then, of course, Donald Trump came in and lifted all those. But the technology is still in place, and I think the will is still there. And I think that the oil and gas companies have awakened to the fact that the world has changed, and they're going to have to change. And I think we need to do something quickly. This is a crisis, and I think nothing would do more to restore hope in younger people than us taking some real action in the area of climate change.
We'll run through some issues that we asked your opponents about, and we'll start with immigration. Be specific about what you support and don't support, and on related border security, your thoughts about a border wall.
What saddens me is that I went to Congress in 2003, and we've been having the same discussion for that entire time. But back then, it seemed like a really bad dream. And now, because of the actions taken by the Trump administration, it seems like a really bad nightmare. And so there's going to have to be a lot of undoing in terms of the policies that have been put into effect, whether that has to do with applying for asylum or the separation of families. I think one of the number one priorities needs to be to try to reunite the families that have been separated, and I'm very fearful as to whether we're going to be able to accomplish that. We need to return to the old policies that we would not separate children from their families except in very rare circumstances, as we were doing during the Obama administration. And during the presidential campaign, I felt like Julian Castro said something that was very powerful and right on the mark when he said that strong borders and respect for refugees do not have to be mutually exclusive propositions. And I think that should sort of serve as the baseline for our policy going forward. I also agree that Section 1325 of the Immigration Hospitality Act should be repealed. I don't think we need to criminalize folks who are trying to come into our country. I think the wall is an absurd idea. Obviously, we're going to have barriers in certain places. We always have, and nothing about that is going to change for strategic purposes. But also, we can take greater advantage of technology and the use of drones to guard a larger swath of the border, to send messages down to Border Patrol agents. And if we need more Border Patrol agents, then so be it. But we need to get away from the militarization of the Border Patrol. And also, having just gone down to the border a couple weeks ago and having seen where they're recommending, I went to the Butterfly Center, and you see what the impact would be, where they would lose 2/3 of their land. And it's far away from the river, so it's not going to be like right on the edge of the Rio Grande. And what they're saying, if you put military boats on the river, you could do a much better job of guarding the border than what they're proposing. And what it looks like when you're down there and you're seeing it in living color is that it's a giant land grab and a huge payout to a lot of contractors, but it really doesn't have a whole hell of a lot to do with national security. And so I would really like to see, in terms of strengthening the border, the focus be on honest to goodness security measures. And I definitely want to see a pathway to citizenship, not only for the dreamers, but also for the millions of individuals who have been living here lawfully and contributing to our economy. And I think forcing people in the shadows is a really bad idea.
So Juan and I met when we were both younger, and I was working at Workers' Defense Project, organizing undocumented workers. And so I spent over a decade seeing up close the costs of an economic system that was willing to accept undocumented workers' labor, but not their full humanity. Half of the people who build our homes, our states, are undocumented in the construction industry. I think we have to acknowledge that the majority of the food that we consume in this country is picked by undocumented hands, harvested by undocumented hands. We need to overhaul our entire immigration system to actually work in the best interests to protect the sanctity of families and both the rights of immigrant and American workers. I think we can build that system. We can modernize our system. We need a more efficient system to match our labor needs, where people can come to the country safely and legally, where we invest in their full integration to make sure we're protecting their rights, which also protects the rights of American workers. When we look at the current system we have, the truth is we talk a lot about the border, but half of the people that are undocumented in this country are visa overstays that never came through the border. It's not the right question about how we address immigration. So I want to see us do 4 things. One is actually change how we allow people to come to the country. I worked with former Secretary of Labor Ray Marshall when I was at Workers' Defense Project to outline some of the best strategies on future flow to allow people to come to the country and would match our labor needs with allowing people to come. I think we can build that system. That would also invest more heavily into the protection of American and immigrant workers' rights. Right now in this country, we spend 10 times more on immigration customs enforcement's budget than we do on protecting the rights of American workers. And then I want us to also change our current system. We have always made central in the past building an immigration system that kept families together, that a recognition as a country that when families are together, our communities and country is stronger. I believe that we need to build that system and also acknowledge that the greatest thing that will drive people besides economic need to cross borders is to be with their loved ones. And so we need to allow people to be able to develop a system that does that. And then the last thing we need to do is go after the root causes of why people are migrating in the first place, which are for economic needs, climate change, and then greater investment in security, and especially with the current drug war and massive violence that we see in Central America and Mexico. I think those are the top things that we need to do. And then the last thing I want to say that I want to bring to this debate that we have around immigration is I really do not believe that John Cornyn and Donald Trump are just afraid of people like my 62-year-old immigrant Mexican mother, but this is the same debate we have had as a country about who gets to be an American. And that I truly also believe that they are afraid of people like me, who are a U.S. citizen daughter that can vote. And we need to acknowledge that so much of the debate is about race and who is actually an American, and I believe every single one of us can be an American no matter where we come from.
I think we have garnered the attention of people all across, not just this nation, but across the world in terms of the atrocities that are taking place at our border. Certainly, I think that with regard to family separation, that must stop immediately. Family unification must be a priority in terms of just how inconsistent it has been with our American values to engage in such a practice, particularly in the inhumane ways that people are being treated. I think what that attention should also lead to is the focus on the fact that we have failed as a federal government to codify into law comprehensive immigration reform. Right now, much of our immigration activity or changes in policy are vis-a-vis executive order. And I think Congress must act. We cannot have new executive orders as the one that was issued by President Trump, in which our Governor Abbott, has now become the first state to say that we don't want more resettlements here. To decline resettlements, I think, are inconsistent with our humanitarian value system, and I think is just quite simply wrong. I think we have to get in line the question, or address the question, why are lines as long as they are? There are people who have been waiting to enter this country legally since the 1990s, and that is in fact far too long in terms of a wait line. We need to revamp and revisit how we in fact address those quotas that are in fact in place right now. I think in addition to that, we need to think critically about where we should be putting resources, and I don't think we should be taking resources like disaster relief funding, as did Donald Trump, and putting it toward making a campaign promise or fulfilling a campaign promise of what he has labeled as a big beautiful wall. I think of course there might be some physical boundaries that are part of what border security looks like, or the boundaries of this country look like, but by no means should we be spending the types of money that Donald Trump is talking about spending with respect to the boundaries. Having a secure border does not mean that we have to have an electric fence all across the country. I think we have to be smart about the resources that we do have and keep our border secure, but also be smart about what policies we do have in place. Right now, I live in a city, Houston, in which a quarter of our residents are foreign-born. The notion that we would then begin to really mistreat our own residents was very much something that we resist and continue to resist today, simply because of the fact that we know who's contributing to our communities. Our communities are comprised of families, and our families who are simply working, wanting to make a good life for themselves, make a good life for their families, should be able to be kept together and have a safe pathway towards citizenship. I think the resources we put into discussions on deportation need to be focused on things like human trafficking, for example, which is at epidemic levels in our country. Those are the ways that I think we need to make sure that we're engaging upon immigration reform that is sound and makes sense for everyone.
Quick follow-up on the topic. In the past, compromises have been floated with regard to comprehensive immigration reform. In other words, an alternative would be guest worker programs or more temporary visas. Those ideas have been floated by Republicans. Are those ideas hold any appeal to you? Is there room for compromise there?
I think there's room for a discussion, but I think ultimately it's got to be a discussion with your eyes open in terms of where there's opportunity to exploit. And when you have those worker, like the Bracero programs or the older programs that used to exist, that have existed over time, you have the opportunity also to exploit people in that realm. And I think we have to be very sensitive to that. And I would not be a proponent of pushing that forward, but I certainly would have a conversation. That's part of what government has to be about. You've got to be willing to have the conversation at the table. Maybe there might be some elements of that you can bring into the fold. In the tech space where I've worked extensively, the limitation on visas that have been extended have caused problems. I know that that's been a problem in Austin in terms of work, just looking at those work visas being extended to people. And certainly we want to be sensitive to that and know that certainly there are certain areas and certain ways in which some of that can be helpful, but I don't think that is the end-all be-all solution to the issue of what do we do with the 11 million people who are living here today in this country who are not documented but who are raising families and contributing to our society. I think we should have a conversation, but I don't think it ends with that as a clear solution.
Same question.
As someone that worked with immigrant workers, worked with visa workers, worked with the labor movement, I really do believe that those programs are rife for exploitation, which is why you see the labor movement very opposed to them, especially in industries that have high foreign-born populations. When I remember working on cases where workers were here with a work program visa, and then their employers would take their passports and they would be tied long term to one employer, that it would be difficult for them to leave. And it just opened the entire programs to exploitation of people not being paid, people almost working in enslaved-like conditions, or even modern enslaved conditions because of those policies. What I want to see is us actually allow people to come long-term to fill our labor needs, legalize the status of people here, and then invest more heavily and more robustly into the enforcement of workers' rights across the board, from fully funding OSHA, the Wage and Hour Division, the NLRB, and the EEOC, which are very underfunded. And I think that would do more to protect the rights of both immigrant workers and American-born workers than extending visa programs. I will also say the irony is not lost on me that John Cornyn has accepted millions of dollars from the construction industry, which is the largest employer of undocumented labor, and is willing to support programs like these, but is not willing to support a pathway to citizenship for people that have been in this country long term, that it creates a second tier of citizenship. It creates a long-term second tier and class of people and individuals in our society, which I do not believe our country will benefit from long term.
I believe the current situation leaves the door open for massive exploitation of immigrants, and also a great deal of cruelty under this administration, the way families are being torn apart, people who lived here the majority of their lives sent back to a country that they hardly even know. So this is one of those things where you'd have to see the details of the proposal, but if it's a guest worker proposal that allows people to come out of the shadows and work here safely and continue to contribute to our economy, and then also have a pathway to citizenship built into the proposal, I would be fine with that. But these types of proposals that suggest that people should go back to their homeland and then come back over, I think are rather absurd, and that's never going to happen, certainly given the number of people that we're talking about. But I really do think the number one goal needs to be some type of program that identifies who these folks are, so that they can work in our system legally, and can stop some of the exploitation that's taking place. I don't think it's lost on anyone sitting here why a lot of folks in the construction industry and other industries that rely heavily on immigrants for their labor force are so concerned about immigration reform. It's probably not for the same reasons that I am. And I don't think they should be allowed to get their way just so that they can continue to take advantage of those individuals. And so I think it might be a good way to build in some regulations so you can stop the exploitation through a guest worker program.
Start with you on this one. Your position on gun reforms, gun violence.
I think that the gun debate is the best example of just how broken our democracy is, and that when you have 80 to 90% of the American people wanting red flag laws and universal background checks, and still no action being taken by Congress because the Republicans are so in the hand of the NRA. The NRA that represents about 6% of gun owners in the United States. That's a broken democracy. That means the will of the people really doesn't matter anymore. And we have to get beyond that. This is insane what is happening, and I strongly support the universal background checks and the red flag laws, but I think we have to go further than that. And long before I decided to get in the Senate race, actually it was after the mass shooting in Parkland, Florida, I wrote an op-ed for the Houston Chronicle about the need for a ban and buyback program that would be fashioned after what they did in Australia back in the 80s. And they haven't had any more mass shootings in Australia. And since that time, and people say, well, that's Australia. Well, yeah, it is, but they had very large gun ownership, and they had a very active gun movement in Australia. The lawmakers who were proposing it were burned in effigy and incidentally got reelected. But it was a tough fight, and it's going to be a tough fight here. But we can't just keep doing the same old thing. And what really turned the tide for me on this is when a former associate who's a Marine, former Marine, told me that he has the highest marksmanship rating in the Marine Corps. But he told me what he had to go through to get access to his assault weapon on active duty. And it's not like it's just sitting by the bed or in a locker. It has to be checked out and then signed back in, and they have to know where that assault weapon is at all times. And to think that some individual can just have one sitting under their bed or in their closet and then just get upset one day and decide to drive miles and miles so that they can kill as many people as possible, because that's all that those guns are really designed to do, is kill people. That sickens me. So I don't believe they belong in the hands of individuals, and I'll do everything in my power to stop it. And the good news is, while the NRA has always had a lot of money, Moms Demand Action is now raising more money than the NRA. And I assure you, those individuals aren't going to stop until we see real gun reform here in the United States.
So I support the Second Amendment. I grew up around guns, but I also graduated high school the year of the Columbine shooting. And I've been waiting my entire adult life to see Congress act and do very basic things like pass universal background checks, ban assault-style weapons. And instead we decided as a country to teach a generation of young people to learn to play dead in their classrooms. That seemed like the more logical response to some of our politicians to the gun epidemic that we face. I am proud to have endorsed the March for Your Lives peace plan that was created by the young people out of Stoneman Douglas High School that looks at how we deal with massive gun violence, to also the high rate of violence that disproportionately impacts women, people of color, and children, and also the high number of deaths that we see with suicide in this country from gun violence. So yes, I support a universal background check. Yes, I support a ban on assault-style weapons, and I also support a mandatory buyback program for individuals that believe that assault-style weapons, weapons of war, do not belong in the hands of civilians for future purchases because of the massive carnage and pain and suffering that they can cause. Then I don't believe that we need to get the millions that are already in circulation in our country out of the hands of civilians to make our communities, our schools safe. And so for me, I don't know how it is for Chris and Amanda, but everywhere I've traveled, this has been one of the number one issues that people talk about, no matter what kind of community I'm in, what income bracket, what race or ethnicity, that people are desperate and hungry for real action on this issue in this state, especially after El Paso and Odessa. I believe that these policies that I support are the best way to deal with the epidemic that we face as a country.
One of the things that is very striking to me is that since we got into the race, we've had multiple mass shootings in Texas. And the response of our sitting incumbent U.S. Senator has been things like saying the issue is complex. Well, I believe that the issue requires us to exercise common sense. And if you're in a role that has complex issues, or as you see them as complex, it's your responsibility to come up with solutions. It isn't our responsibility to say that's for someone else to do, or we're just going to fold our hands and watch people lose their lives. Besides for mass shootings, there are simply too many homicides taking place in our country. This is not just a mass shootings issue. It's not just an in the grocery store issue. It's an in your home issue. It's an in domestic disputes issue. It's widespread. And we have to make sure that we have common sense gun policies in place that protect people. It doesn't mean that there is not a Second Amendment right. Certainly that right exists and it will continue to exist, and you have to respect that. But there have to be safeguards in place, particularly safeguards that we find consensus on, like of making sure that we have background checks, and we are closing the gun show loophole, and we're making sure that there are red flag policies, and making sure that we have weapons of war, restricting access to those being on the street. Those are the things that I think we can put into place that are consistent with what many Americans would agree with and can serve and protect the people that we're elected to represent. I think that's critically important, that we not stand by and just talk about what happens after the fact. And that's been John Cornyn's response. He had some measures that he discussed, many of which were talking about how to expedite what happens after the fact once there has been a mass shooting. How about working on prevention in this country? We have a problem in this country where we just do not do that. We don't do it with healthcare. We don't do it with gun violence. We don't do it across a very broad spectrum. And that's the type of leadership that we need to be electing into office, is people who will be forward-looking and not just think about how we respond and how we react, but have a vision on what it can be and put forth policy that can help us collectively achieve that goal. And that's what we need to do in order to move the needle forward. It is a shame that we have watched children mobilize in this country after facing the fear that they have been experiencing in these school shootings, and yet we still don't have the courage to actually lead and do something about it. We have got to get leaders in office who will lead with courage rather than fear or a preoccupation with maintaining an A+ rating with the NRA. I made good grades in my lifetime, but an A+ from the NRA is not going to be one of them.
We hear a lot from Democrats and others that the stock market economy is leaving large numbers of Americans behind. What would you do specifically to address jobs in the economy? Specifics, if you can.
Absolutely. I think my two priorities are healthcare and economic opportunity for all. And when I say that, I believe in making sure that whatever you are seeing as your vision for the economy, that it has to be inclusive. And I don't just mean inclusive in terms of race, in terms of demographic information. I also mean geographically. I had the great fortune to be a part of what's called the New Deal leaders, which are democratic leaders across the country who are looking for opportunities to promote growth and can promote inclusion and a number of policies in that regard. And I led the Future of Work group, in which we looked at and identified what could we do on a state and local level that would help create an economy that was inclusive, and also address the issue that is the big elephant in the room, which is automation. More people in this country are afraid of automation in terms of job security than they are of foreign competition. And as a result, we have to actually have policies in place that actually help people be a part in light of automation. We can't ignore the fact that it's coming, it's come, and it's going to continue to progress. Innovation will continue to happen, but then what happens to the people who lose their jobs as a result? We need to be able to address that and make an economy that is inclusive, that they see themselves in that economy today and tomorrow. Some examples of that include when you're looking at it from, let's say, a rural context, and there are a number of cases where we have documented millions of people who are not connected to the internet because they lack broadband internet connectivity. It's called an internet broadband desert. They don't just exist in rural contexts, they actually exist in cities as well. And making sure that we are putting the infrastructure into place and the funding for that so that people are connected to jobs, people are connected to employment opportunities, applications, schooling, all of that virtually. In addition to that, why not incentivize, instead of just seeing where there's been economic downturn, we could also be incentivizing workforce jobs, actually back office jobs that are sustainable wage paying jobs with benefits, to also be located in markets like rural markets that have seen economic depression. We could be incentivizing that in this very moment. That would put people to work, that would also take some of the pressure off of rural hospitals, which are continuing to close in Texas. In fact, we are #1 for rural hospital closures in the nation. And so we have got to put those types of jobs and access points in front of people where they are. It's called meeting people where they are. In addition to that, look at advanced manufacturing. Why not have portable workforce credits that you could take with you so that in the context of a job in which the machinery that you operate changes. Instead of that job, simply that change in machinery, meaning your job will go away, why not have an ability to have that ongoing lifelong training so that you will be trained for an upward mobility opportunity within the same industry or same job, as opposed to simply getting a pink slip. These are ways that we connect people to what is actually happening with respect to automation and the evolving nature of the economy, but it also meets people where they are today.
So runaway inequality, I think, is also dangerous for democracy. That we have half of people over age of 55 have $0 in retirement savings in this country, that 60% of Americans don't have more than $1,000 in savings, and that by 2023, an estimated 40% of student debt borrowers are going to be in default on their student loans, that the economic crisis that we face in this country requires an approach to job creation that also looks at how to create a more equal society. For me, it's about the incredible legislation we just saw passed in the House to help revitalize the labor movement, the PRO Act that was just passed that will make it easier for people to form labor unions in this country. When the labor movement was the strongest in this country, our middle class was the strongest. We also need to fully invest into the protection of Americans' rights. Again, fully funding the EEOC, the Wage and Hour, OSHA, the NLRB. I also want to level the playing field for small businesses. As someone that ran 2 small nonprofits and also in the construction industry, worked with many small businesses, that there are basic needs that to create real economic security in this country, where half of the people employed in this country work for small businesses. And yet we talk about the healthcare crisis, but the reality is that many small businesses feel like they cannot compete against large-scale employers to negotiate for things like healthcare or retirement benefits. So I want to level the playing field for those small businesses, and it's why I support Medicare for all, because I know that it would be a huge equalizer and for small businesses and large-scale corporations to be able to make sure everyone had healthcare in this country. And then I want us to invest more heavily in changing our education system to match our economic needs as a country. 60% of all new jobs in Texas require a bachelor's degree, but roughly 30% of Texans over age 25 have one. So we simply do not have the level of educated workforce that we need. I believe as a country, what used to be a high school diploma is now a bachelor's degree, and so we need to expand tuition-free education from K through 12 to K through college, a bachelor's degree, or vocational school. That it would be one of the greatest economic investments we could make. And then I want to position Texas and our country as a leader in this massive global transition to a green energy future. So half of all global investment that happened last year into renewable energy happened from China. We have a huge oil and gas sector, but that's why I think that if we were at the forefront of moving forward the Green New Deal, we could be making sure that not only are we creating the most wind and solar jobs in the country, that we could also be making sure that we're bringing manufacturing of those wind and solar panels here to Texas and to other parts of the country instead of in China. We could be making sure that we're investing in our research institutions and creating a 21st century transportation system that would create millions of good jobs across the country. So those are the 4 things I want to do.
I think it begins with education, and I have a strong belief that when anyone leaves high school, they should be ready to do one of 2 things, either go to college or go to work. And on the latter, I think a lot of times we're missing the boat. I think we could do a lot better job of incentivizing vocational education and labor apprenticeship programs, which really prove to be a ticket to the middle class for individuals who have that kind of training. And we moved away from that years ago, and I think we need to move back in that direction. The truth of the matter is there are a lot of folks that aren't going to go to college, but if they get out without knowing any kind of trade whatsoever, they're going to probably wind up working at close to a minimum wage job. I definitely think we need to raise the minimum wage to at least $15 an hour. I proposed minimum wage legislation all the way back when I was in Congress, and I can't believe we're still debating it, but it's desperately needed. I also think we need to invest in areas that really are going to be job creators, like infrastructure projects, and I think there's bipartisan support for that. Our infrastructure is crumbling all across our state, all across the United States, and there are a number of infrastructure projects that would lead to massive employment. I also think that we need to be making strong investments in historically impoverished communities. That's one of the proposals that Michael Bloomberg has put on the table, and I think it's an excellent idea. There's a perfect example in Houston, Texas. Sunnyside is one of the most historically impoverished neighborhoods in all of Houston. There's a deserted landfill there that they propose building into a giant solar farm. It would be great for economic empowerment and job creation, and I called the sustainability officer of the city of Houston and I said, how much federal money are they getting for the project? Zero, because of course the Trump administration isn't investing in those types of projects. But those are the types of projects we need to be identifying all across the United States. And I also think that setting up funding for minority entrepreneurs is a great idea. Probably the major beneficiaries of that will be African American women. That's a huge growth sector if they can get the money to start their businesses. And I think all of those will lead to greater job creation. And as far as going on in college, I would like to see free community college. I think 2 years can oftentimes lead to job training or a great foundation to go on to a 4-year university. And I would like to see steps taken to increase funding and for 4-year colleges and student debt. I don't know if we're going to talk about that, but I think that's going to have to be addressed as well.
Last quick question we asked your opponents is, presumably you'd need to appeal to swing voters to win in the statewide election. How do you appeal to them, and on what issues, and how are you the best candidate to do that? I guess we'll put that on.
Well, I guess it depends on how you identify swing voters. The largest voting bloc for a very long time in the state of Texas has self-identified as independent. But for a number of years, those independents were routinely voting Republican. So while they may have said they were independent, they weren't really. And you have a lot of those individuals, I think, now who have come over to the Democratic side. And I think they will continue on that side because of what they've seen in recent years. And I believe that many of the progressive positions have become mainstream positions, and I think what a lot of swing voters and all voters have gotten tired of, especially on the Democratic side, is the lack of action coming out of Washington. Seeing a lot of good legislation being passed in the House only to go to the Senate, which has become the place for all bills to go and die. And I think, if you start talking about these issues that really hit people where they live, and health care, a concern for everybody, the environment is a concern, I think, when people are waking up to the fact that that's a concern for everybody. Gun violence, sadly, has become an issue for just about everyone because of what we've seen here in our state. And so I think the Democratic Party is very right on the issues. And I think the other thing that we have is the great motivating force, and that is Donald Trump. He has been extraordinarily inspirational for the Democratic Party, and he has brought people out of the woodwork in a way that I don't think many of us thought we would ever see, probably in a way that we couldn't have done for ourselves. But I think we saw it we saw it in 2018, and now with him at the top of the ticket in 2020, I think we're going to see it in even larger numbers. And because we have a senator who's decided to tie himself at the hip to Donald Trump, he's going to have to answer for a lot of those sins. And so I think it's a real opportunity here for the Democratic Party because of all those factors.
So as someone that's spent 15 years traveling the state, working with ordinary people and making them believe in a political process that they often felt excluded from or unheard, I know that in Texas there generally is no progressive choir to preach to. There are only a bunch of non-believers to convert. But that's the work that I love doing, that I've given my career and life to. when I think about the issues that I stand up for, that there are many issues that we think about as progressive issues that actually are not necessarily progressive issues, that if you look at the states that have on ballot measures raised the minimum wage, many of them have been Republican states. That when you look at people that I worked with when I was at United Auto Workers that then switched over, that voted for Bernie Sanders and then voted for Donald Trump, it was because they had deep economic harm and pain that they were living through every single day, and they wanted that to be spoken to. I know that in my campaign I speak to that, and that deeply, especially in this political moment, that people are desperate for democracy to work in the best interests of the American people, that people are cynical, that people have high levels of mistrust, and that many of my reforms that I talk about, I get the greatest support, bipartisan support, as I've traveled the state when I talk about that my number one priority is rewriting the rules of democracy. I have been impressed by how many people really are desperate for change on that level. And then the truth is that, you know, when I worked at Jolt, I worked with young people that saw themselves as independents, that they couldn't tell you the difference between a Democrat and Republican oftentimes. But they knew they didn't like Donald Trump. But they really didn't know, you know, I think about this young man, Matthew Lopez, who joined our campaign. He's 24 years old, very articulate about why he doesn't like Donald Trump. Joined our campaign as our videographer, and then says to me, "It's so cool, you're in your Senate race, Cristina, but who's John Cornyn?" Right? And that is a huge portion of the electorate that I want to speak to. I'm running a Get Out the Vote campaign where I don't take any voters for granted. When I think about the kind of campaign that I want to embody, I think about the person I think of as the governor of Georgia, Stacey Abrams, who won that race, who didn't take any community of color, any low-income person, any voter for granted, and fully brought them into her race to be represented. And that's how I believe we win in Texas, by representing the needs of ordinary people, having the courage to buck our own party if need be, and always standing up for what we truly believe in, and making sure that we speak to the diverse electorate of who Texas is. And as someone that's done that, I'm proud that my campaign is going to do that too, and that's our pathway to victory.
When I first ran for office in 2015, I was told that race was going to be too big for me. At that time, it was 2.3 million people that I was going to be embarking upon serving. And I was told that because it was my first race, I was young, I was a woman, all of the reasons why I could not. And what I do know about is what brings us together and what servant leadership is about. And part of what is about building community and servant leadership with community happens to be on some principles that don't have the color red or the color blue, but people want authenticity and trust with their leaders. They want to be able to communicate and hear the truth, sometimes the truth you will like and sometimes the truth you won't. But they also want to make sure that they're able to communicate and access their elected officials. And that's one of the things I'm very proud of in my work as an at-large Houston City Council member. We have kept our doors open, we have engaged, we have activated people, we have empowered them to be a part of the solutions that they desperately want to see. And beyond that, we've also made it about them. So while a lot of the times we make these elections about people and the candidates themselves and our personal stories, what it's truthfully supposed to be about is about the people that we represent, listening, engaging them about the solutions that they desperately want to see, hear, touch, and feel. That's what we have to make this about. And when you do that and you actually embrace that active engagement, you listen, you then come up with solutions that really are organic and uniquely tailored to the problems at hand. And some of those will have broad universal appeal, but others won't. But if you apply the same factors, that you're going to have the ability to weigh the pros and the cons, you're going to apply logic, you are going to look at outcomes for the whole and for that individual community, I think you come up with a type of servant leadership that we are desperately needing in today's politics. And that's what I bring to the table. And when I ended up running for that seat, not only did I get more votes, obviously, than my opponent because I won, I got more votes than anybody running because we engaged the community. And that's where this has to go on a statewide basis as well. We have got to be willing to bring independents into the fold, actively listen to them, and of course appeal. So I am not so much someone who has said I am unwilling to listen. And so making sure that you have that type of servant leader at the table. My politics in terms of my stances, my beliefs about what are the healthcare fixes, I think really embody the things that I heard people say. Some people say, I want to keep my doctor, I want to keep my employer-based coverage. Others say, this doesn't work for me. Bringing together the things that you're hearing and compromising and making it work for everybody, I think, is the type of leadership that I bring to the table, and precisely the way that we'll be able to get a broad coalition of folks across a broad political spectrum on board and ready to elect their next U.S. Senator.
Open it up to questions.
Who are you going to vote for in the Democratic presidential primary?
I am making up my mind as we speak.
Next.
Me and my policies align with Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders.
One of those two.
One of those two.
Most likely Michael Bloomberg. I think he's right on so many issues, climate change and guns, and has really been willing to, and healthcare, and has been willing to put his money where his mouth is and done a tremendous amount of good work. And I think he's going to put his money where his mouth is again during this presidential campaign.
But how does this, so much of your success is going to depend on how well the Democrat does against President Trump, and those are very different paths, particularly between Bernie and Biden, or Bernie and Bloomberg, or Warren. I mean, there are people who will tell you that one or the other of those is fatal to Democratic chances in Texas. How important is it, and do you have a theory of, I guess starting with you, do you have a theory of why Bernie or Elizabeth Warren could win Texas?
Well, they're taking 40% of the electorate vote, and I think 538 just reported that Bernie is set to win Texas, most likely is what they're predicting. I think that we live in a time where people are desperate for real big structural change. Even if you elected someone like Michael Bloomberg to unseat what I believe is a fascist president, that the part of the way he was elected was because of the real economic pain and harm that the majority of Americans are living every single day. Unless you answer that, we will swing back in the other direction. I'm used to Texas after doing politics in this state for 15 years, used to us being ignored by the National Party at times. So I know that no matter what, I'm planning on running my own campaign as a Texan that speaks to the real needs that I believe Texans want change on.
Do you think that your chances would be as good with Bernie Sanders at the top of the ticket as it would be with another candidate?
I think certainly there's a gradation of how that turns out, and so obviously in terms of what your politics are, whose appeal you're most connected to, I think does have an impact. I mean, it's one of those things where it's not like we're running on a joint ticket, so it's not anything that you can affirmatively do something about unless you do in fact really push one particular candidate. I think what we've seen with this electorate, and to be frank with you, I'm disappointed about some of the diversity that has dropped out of this race. I think it was we still have women in the race, but we've lost some of our diversity. I think that would have been great to continue to have that, especially when you see the electorate change since 2016 so drastically, having over 2.6 million new registered voters, of which over 1.6 million of them are people of color or under the age of 25. That's a huge shift in terms of what's happening in our politics. And so do I think that there's one particular candidate that would be fatal? No, I don't. Do I think that there are some candidates that you would be more akin to than others? Of course. But ultimately, that's not within our purview. I think what we have to focus on in this race against John Cornyn is making the case why the Senate race matters, and then why you are the person that needs to represent Texans in the U.S. Senate, so that next time an impeachment trial rolls around, you will actually take seriously your obligation and responsibility to actually weigh the evidence and witnesses and not just make it a political vote down the line.
I don't offer support for Michael Bloomberg as a way of criticizing the other Democratic candidates. I think that Bernie Sanders has created an extraordinary discussion in America on a lot of different issues. I think Elizabeth Warren is brilliant. Pete Buttigieg has certainly acquitted himself very well on the campaign trail, and a lot of people didn't think he had the experience to do so. And I love Joe Biden, thought he was a great vice president. But I do think in terms of what he's been able to accomplish and the ideas that he's put on the table, I think Michael Bloomberg would be an extraordinary candidate. He, in addition to all the other initiatives, whether it's, guns or climate or whatever it might be, he's also put forth this Greenwood initiative, which I think is phenomenal in terms of addressing systemic racism, something that I think is going to be extraordinarily important going forward. And I'm very happy to see it coming out of an Anglo's campaign, because the Anglo community is going to have to be part of that discussion. We're going to have greater knowledge of the sins of the past if we're going to be able to craft solutions going forward. And so I certainly salute him for what he's put forward. So that's where I'm coming from. And I think pretending that whoever's at the top of the ticket is not going to affect folks down ballot is somewhat ridiculous given what we've seen historically, and it will have an impact. But it's such a strange year, and because of the discord that Donald Trump has caused. And I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of the different candidates match up well against him, even in a state like Texas.
And would you and Amanda associate yourself with Christina's description of him as a fascist? Trump as a fascist?
I'm sorry?
Would you associate yourself with Christina's description of Trump as a fascist?
It's not far off the mark. I've associated with a lot of worse things, I think. I don't know. I mean, but my problem with, I feel like Donald Trump is eating our souls as we watch. And
A fascist would eat yourself.
I think he's corrupt and divisive and reckless, and then points to the economy to try to shield himself. And I don't think that's going to be a strong enough shield for him.
I would concur. I think he's been detrimental to our American values and what division has come about and distraction. Let me just get to that message, because, while we talk about or let Donald Trump lead the narrative, I think that is a huge mistake in terms of him being the leader of our country and leading a narrative into division. The real reason I think Donald Trump has decided to use this big, beautiful wall, as he's characterized it to be, as space and place for opportunity for him is to wedge us against each other and distract us from the real issues at hand, which is an inability of the government to appropriately intervene and create solutions for people in terms of the economy. He has used that and created scapegoats and said, this is that person's fault, and blame them because of the color of their skin, or blame this person because of what country they came from, and so on and so forth. I don't have to recount all of the many ways in which Donald Trump has exhibited less than appropriate behavior and more in an emphasis on division. I think the truth is we've got to have not just about this U.S. Senate race, not make this about Trump. This has to be about what vision are we creating? And that has been the problem, is that we just look at what we don't like, but what do we want? What can we create collectively? And how do we look forward and build forward? That's what we have to aspire to. We've had an extraordinary president in President Obama recently. And what he did so very well was to give someone an ability, as we call it, the audacity to hope. I mean, the notion that you could actually believe in something that doesn't exist today, that's where we need to go back to. That's where we will get our entrepreneurial spirit, our ingenuity, our ability to be optimistic and creative and innovative. That's where that will come back to when we get back focused, when we get our focus back on making sure we're looking forward than the back, make our country great again, or whatever he says. That's not the direction we need to be heading. The question for people who feel left out is, how do we include you into the future? That's how we need to think, have a positive spin on this. So I try as much as possible, not to focus my energy on Trump or the things that he's done to divide and distract us, because I think it's been detrimental to our progress as a society and as a whole.
Do y'all remember the Russia's Right bumper stickers from years ago, back in the 90s? When the Houston Press advertised where you could get a bumper sticker that said Russia's Reich, R-E-I-C-H, so I sent off for it and put it on my car. I was quite proud of it, but then to watch that individual receive the Medal of Freedom the other night was really something.
I just wanted to add, look, I'm going to vote for whoever the Democratic candidate is. I knocked on doors for Bernie Sanders, then I knocked on doors for Hillary Clinton. But in this political moment that we live in, anyone that tries to predict election outcomes, exactly what will happen, I think is either delusional or lying, because we live in a political moment where we cannot be clear what the outcome will be, and that no matter who the president is or what happens, that I'll be working incredibly hard to win, and doing that in my own way and own Texas progressive flavor.
Quick question, quick answer, run out of time, I'm sure. Should pathway to citizenship be available only to people already here in violation of our laws, or do you envision an ongoing program going on in perpetuity where future people who come here in violation of our laws would have a pathway to citizenship? Start on this end.
I think that when I describe that, I'm talking about the 11 million people who are here in this country. I think going forward, we will, as a part of a comprehensive immigration overhaul, can have a reset on what this looks like. But I think we have to answer that question, because what has happened is we've not answered it. And so we've just seen this debate go on and on for decades now in terms of what happens to a class of people and a group of people who have been working and building families and communities here. And I think we have to answer that question with the 11 million people who are currently here.
Retroactive or ongoing?
So I think the entire system needs overhauled. The reality is that I think we must offer a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million people that are here in this country, but we also have to recognize that many of them, we created an economic system that was willing to accept their labor and not grant them full rights or a pathway to citizenship, and that ultimately hurt us. What I want us to do is look at how we change the program going forward, so we are matching our labor needs and our economic needs with actually the flow of immigration in a legal, safe way to come to this country, and I think it would help deal with a huge proportion of the cases that we face. And then also what we also have to acknowledge is that half of the visa overstays are where we have a huge portion of the undocumented population come
But
from.
regardless of whatever system we put in place, we'll always have people either coming here or overstaying illegally. In the future, should they be eligible for pathway to citizenship?
We need to. I can't say what will happen in the future. What I can say is that any program that I'm going to support is going to look at future flow to be able to address making sure that people are able to come to the country safely and legally to meet our labor needs, but also come as full human beings. I can't tell you what's going to happen in 20 years, and will we have done that in an immigration program? I really hope so. But if we haven't, do I blame undocumented immigrants for our failures of Congress to act? No.
It's an excellent question, but I think any type of guest worker program that included a pathway to citizenship or any kind of pathway to citizenship proposal has to be coupled with addressing border security. But the truth of the matter is people are going to continue to come to this country. I'll never forget the president of IBC Bank years ago saying, he lives in Laredo, and said as long as people are living in cardboard boxes on mudslide hills, they're going to find a way to come into our country that they see as the land of the opportunity. And that aspect is going to have to be addressed. And I don't think you can say, hey, if you succeed, just sign up and you can get in line. And so I think there's going to have to be a set of laws to address those who continue to come in. And I think we have to try to strengthen our border. I don't think you do that with a wall. I do think there are ways to do it effectively, as I pointed out earlier, and with other methods. But I do think that's going to have to be addressed.
Last quick question, and it can be a brief answer, but what gives you hope? The common prevailing wisdom, if that's the word, is that John Cornyn has the distinct advantage in November, especially if there's a runoff here in the Democratic primary. What gives you hope? What have you seen on the ground that gives you hope that you can win
Well, we used to have a 1 million vote gap, and with 2 million folks who had been identified as Democratic voters who weren't voting. And so the idea was how, gradually are you going to get those 2 million folks to become regular voters? And then we see that gap cut to some 200,000 voters in one election cycle, in an off-year election. And Beto O'Rourke ran an extraordinary campaign, but the win was in those sales from the get-go. And it was not because of Beto, because a lot of people were turning out early on to see Beto who had no idea who he was. I went to a packed Union Hall in Houston when he first announced in the spring of 2017, and it was packed to the gills. And I looked around the room, and I'd been involved in politics in the Houston area for probably 25 years and knew maybe 10 people. I mean, they were coming out of the woodwork, and that just continued all through the election cycle. And it was because of the fear that Donald Trump instilled in people. And I know the feeling because I felt the same way, because after the election in 2016, I felt that anyone who had been involved in Democratic politics had a duty to stay involved. And if you hadn't been involved, you needed to get involved. And we started seeing that almost immediately after the November election. So as I travel around the state, what I see is an incredible amount of energy in a lot of these areas that were bright red when I was growing up. Collin County, places like that, where hundreds will be coming out for events to listen to people. And so the excitement is certainly on our side. And the idea is to capitalize on it, and Cornyn's numbers, quite frankly, aren't where anyone wants to be after 35 years in statewide office, having somewhere between 25 and 35% approval rating, and a third of the people telling the Dallas Morning News pollster that they didn't even know who he was. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. So I think whoever the Democratic nominee is going to be incredibly well funded. It's probably going to be the same kind of money that you saw coming into the O'Rourke campaign. And so John Cornyn's going to have a real fight on his hands.
Joe, goes that?
Yeah. So I'm used to, in my career, being underestimated consistently, but I kind of love being underestimated because then people are not prepared for what I can build and what I can do. That you can ask any construction company or politician that ever went up against me if they regretted underestimating me and the people that I represent. I am used to bringing ordinary people together to face what seem like insurmountable odds and winning. And I think it's because I have two gifts. I have a gift of being able to see a pathway to change where other people don't see one. And then I have a gift of bringing people together to see their common interests and recognize their power, especially when they haven't been able to see it before. And that those two gifts will be really critical in this race. I know that this race will also be nationalized once someone like me is the candidate, where Donald Trump will be attacking Mexicans, immigrants and their children, and Latinos. Well, I am all of those things. I'm used to boxing outside of my weight class, and that this will be a race that I'm ready to do that. And that it will be a clear distinction with someone like me up against John Cornyn about, do we want to look forward as a country? Do we want to be a state and country that's going to be for everyone? Or do we just want a senator that's going to continue to just represent one income bracket, one gender, one race, when that hasn't worked out so well for everyone in our state? So I'm ready for the fight. I think it'll be a fight. I think this will be one of the nastiest fights of any election in the country because of what it will mean to Republicans to lose Texas. But I feel ready for that fight because of what it represents for the rest of the country.
One of the things that is striking for people to learn is how John Cornyn is actually doing in this race before we've even selected our Democratic nominee. He has been polling between 27% and 36% since we've been in this race, not because of any of us, but because of himself and his decision to align with Donald Trump 95% of the time. He has eroded his own base. And if you know anything about politics, you know about the essential nature of having a base. And if you do not have a base, you will not win. And John Cornyn has taken his base for granted, which has been a moderate Republican supporter, and said he will go far to the right along with Donald Trump. And that has caused him to be extremely vulnerable, so vulnerable that he's in fact more vulnerable than Ted Cruz was when he ran. He had a stronger base of support. He was in the 40s. One of the other pieces of this, I think, that is important in terms of this contrast that I offer is someone who has actually been on the ground and unfortunately seen the effects of not having strong, sound leadership in government on the federal level, as we see what has happened and the devastation that has occurred with regard to Harvey recovery, and still the lack of resources that have flown down, that have been bestowed upon the area because of just deciding to do that for political reasons. These are contrasts that I offer beyond just being young, being someone who's a woman of color, being someone who has very local experience. This will be a national race, but I liken it to a scenario like Malcolm Gladwell describes with David and Goliath. And we know of David in the biblical sense. David is the underdog, and David is small in stature, and Goliath is supposed to be large and able to smush David immediately. But what we learn in the Malcolm Gladwell version of the tale is a little bit more about the facts about what David was really, what he brought to the table. And David was an expert marksman. We learned he had great aim. He was an athlete. We also learned more about Goliath, and he wasn't able to move quite as fast. He wasn't able to see it coming. And the truth of the matter is that is very much the scenario here. I, of course, am David, but of course John Cornyn is Goliath, and I think he won't see this challenge coming because the Texas he has always known is not the Texas that exists today. I mentioned to you the changing electorate in the state and how rapidly we've changed just since the 2016 cycle. Imagine what it would feel like for someone who hasn't run for the last 6 years of office. So we've got a fight on our hands, but one that I am very ready for, one that will be exciting because, again, I am the unlikely candidate to take on John Cornyn, but I think that is because of the fact that people don't understand the advantages I bring to the table of being somebody who has not only been on the ground, but someone who has delivered results for the community that I now seek to serve as a senator.